Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. We could hear the anti-aircraft guns on all sides. Perhaps they would keep the planes away from the port itself. But then we heard planes flying low overhead, making the icy air around us vibrate with their passage. We watched them, rubbing our fingertips, which were numb with cold, as they passed over the ruined town, and the men in rows, bowing beneath them like grasses in a wind. They passed over two ships which cast off their moorings to make less of a target. 5 bombs fell simultaneously from the 5 planes gliding over the piers. 2 fell in the water where they burst, covering the waiting men with spray. A third scattered debris on the beach, while the last 2 opened a crater in front of a line of men who would not be leaving until much later. Bodies flew into the air. Some of the survivors gave way to despair, but those who still dared to hope supported them. There were no cries except from a few wounded men who howled without meaning to. There were now some 40 planes overhead, and others were coming up from behind the cliffs to the north. One of them exploded in the air. Perhaps one of our guns had hit it, but there were no cries of triumph as in the old days. Here there was only the noise of war. The men were silent. The ships had drawn somewhat away from the piers, but the men waiting to embark remained in their places so they wouldn't lose them. The planes turned in the sky, probably looking for the most effective positions for letting go their bombs. We watched, trembling with cold and despair, but no one questioned the sanity of the men who remained in line. We knew that, when our turn came, we would do the same thing. At that time and place, hope was worth everything, a fortune which there was no question of staking. Everyone there had invested everything their torments had spared them in the possibilities which those ships represented. The planes came over again, and I hid my eyes so that I couldn't see. The rhythm was too horrible, and in the end I was only human, not God. I hadn't died on the cross, and had no right to watch. The days went by. Memel no longer existed, except on strategic maps. The front had shrunk, but a great many men had embarked. However, there were still thousands waiting their turn, shuttling between the positions they still had to hold and the semi-tombs where they slept their mutilated sleep. I still watched, through my dazed eyes, as these thousands wandered through the heights of tragedy, in a silence which, to my ears, drowned out all the noises of the earth. It is growing dim and vanishing without ever having been seen. We had left our cellar for a pillbox whose gun had been destroyed. I had stuffed my belongings into the space formerly occupied by the gun. Following my example, Hals, Schlesser, and another fellow had done the same. Weiner, Lindbergh, Fairham, and 7 or 8 others occupied what was left of the turret itself. Our new lodging was less humid than the cellar, but that was not the reason for our transfer. We had shifted because in our new quarters we were closer to the various points we might have to reach at maximum speed. Our defense perimeter had shrunk even further because, once again, the Russians had become interested in us. The German troops still holding the tiny Memel stronghold had to face the possibility of serious attacks which might prove decisive. As it was, we were often obliged to approach our positions with extreme caution. Our men, driven beyond desperation, sometimes surrendered to the Russians, who would then put on their captives' rags and wait for the relief. Our wretched men had fallen into this trap several times. Even more often in their exhaustion, they had failed to notice Ivan crawling toward them until it was too late. Then Ivan would replace them. Weiner and 2 other fellows had almost fallen into one of these traps. The veteran had spotted it in time, and had exploded into the kind of rage we knew so well. "He saved us," stammered one of the men who'd been with him. "He let them have all his grenades right in the face." Both men talked in gasps, in an automatic nervous spasm. In fact, they both knew they were probably done for. Weiner said nothing. He had recovered his silence and lay prostrate against the bunker wall, which glittered with frost, while we looked at him. We had grown used to being saved by Weiner. That evening, one of our men had tried to smoke a cigarette retrieved from a Russian cadaver. He had lit it and gone outside to relieve himself. Ivan had sharp eyes. He had spotted the glowing tip of the cigarette, and a 50-millimeter shell had pierced the concrete and burst in our comrade's back. He died without a sound. "Ivan has come even closer," muttered Ferrum. The next day, in a piercing cold, we went to our outermost position, which should have been in Russian hands for some time past. On our way, we passed the last tank remaining in that sector. It was an old M2, which had already been on fire, and which bore the impact marks of many shells. Its own guns had been destroyed and replaced by others which weren't made for it. Each day it moved to a trench, cut through the ruins of an alley, and held Ivan back whenever he tried to get through there. The infantry in its neighborhood had often rescued that old machine from contests that were too unequal, while the soldier gutter rats infesting the ruins nearby held it in respect for the inestimable services it still performed. Today the tank's engine had broken down, and a team of ragged mechanics were laboring over it. We had huddled nearby to watch for a moment. One of the mechanics broke a tool and threw it on the ground in a rage. We heard the others talking. The machine was beyond repair. The men stood around, considering what to do with it. It had become a familiar part of our daily landscape. 2 planes had just flown over the ruins closest to us. All the tank crew took shelter beside the tank and stared up at the planes with feverish intensity. To our surprise, we found ourselves looking at 2 German reconnaissance planes. Where had they come from? They banked when they saw the tank, which no longer bore any insignia. For a moment, we were all seized with a horrifying doubt. Would the planes take us for Russians? We all stepped into the open and waved with our arms spread wide, and the moment passed. The 2 planes flew over us very low to the right. We could see the pilots. One of them even waved. They must have come from a German base, from Germany, where everything was still possible, perhaps. Our gray faces followed their flight until they vanished. In imagination, we followed them for longer still. We were still faced with the problem of the tank. The passage of the 2 planes had given us a fresh stimulus. Everyone was standing around the machine. Someone suggested that we try to push it. Although it was a mad idea, we all took hold of the rough and icy metal. Shouting hoarsely, we tried to establish a rhythm. There were about 30 of us, hoping to synchronize our efforts. Our boots slipped and crunched against the icy ground, but the tank didn't move. Our emaciated bodies seemed to have lost their strength. The 3 crewmen swore at our impotence, but still the tank didn't move. After a hurried discussion, 2 of our men ran to the rear. We were about to follow them when we heard the sound of an engine. There was also a truck left in Memel, which I hadn't known until that moment. However, it arrived, jolting and backfiring. Before it had quite reached the tank, the men had pressed pieces of wood against its radiator to protect it from the shock. Then it nudged up to the tank, shoving it from the rear. For a moment, we thought it was going to stall too. Then, with a series of shoves, we managed to start the tank rolling, lifting it from behind and letting it fall several times. I stared at one of the slowly turning rollers. Its motion struck me as the essence of the miracle of Memel in miniature. The truck's engine roared, and our boots crunched against the solid ground. The tank rolled forward, and we continued on either side of it without losing our grip. My head was swimming from the effort, but I knew that something was happening in direct response to our will. Perhaps such knowledge is what constitutes joy. The heavy roller, studded with rivets, turned, and my eyes devoured it. It had also rolled across the infinity of the steppe, where part of my life had crumbled away, and it was turning now, just as I was still breathing. Joy is as simple as that. It would die perhaps within a short distance, as Hals or I might die, but until death came, it would roll noisily down the slope. I felt very much akin to this huge metal object. In Memel, anything that moved was still alive. I was still alive. We returned twice more to the position. We would go again the next day if we survived the night. However, that night Ivan was very much awake, raining death onto what was left of the town. The ground trembled continuously, and the sky was starred with flares. The light was as strong as broad daylight, reducing the luminous brilliance of the explosions. Our shelter cracked beneath the Russian blows, and as our lungs emptied of air, we sensed the presence of death. Wallers, our leader, tried to kill himself, but we pursued him outside and grabbed him by the belt. During the course of this rescue operation, one of the rescuers was killed. Russian tanks had reached the hill to the south of our camp. Our soldiers who had been in the path of their advance had done their duty before they died. Then a heavy bombardment from the sea had struck the tanks as they slid over the dunes. Several tanks to the south of us went up in flames. The Russians were even forced to retreat a little, fighting as they went. The bombardment from the sea continued. Through the darkness and fog, we could see the luminous discharges of the guns. With daylight, we were able to see the source of our help through heavy curtains of smoke. 2 warships were standing close by the shore. One of them was the Prince Eugen. The other was a ship of the same size. To the desperate defenders of Memel, they were a source of support we had never hoped for. The tanks respected their large guns and kept their distance. In the morning, we were supposed to return to the position described above. Overwhelmed by exhaustion, I had managed to sleep fitfully, like everyone else. Our sleep under these circumstances had its own peculiarities. We slept while we were wide awake, with our eyes open, like extinguished lamps. There was scarcely any difference between our faces and the faces of the dead. When I woke up, I wondered if I would still be able to move. My body felt like dead wood, and I no longer dared look at my arms, which were so emaciated they were like 2 sticks. I felt an intense pain in my chest, as if another battle as fierce as the one outside were raging through my interior. Nonetheless, I had to wrench myself from my torpor. Everyone else looked as strange as I did. I stared at them all once again as I stuffed my crumbling teeth with shreds of cotton torn from the hem of my coat. Their faces were as gray as the faces of the dead. One would have said they were dead, or else perhaps that nothing left in Memel was still alive, which seemed a distinct possibility. We left. The Russians were firing haphazardly now, as if they were just passing the time, a bullet to the left, another to the right. After the night's bombardment, none of it seemed serious. As we drew closer to the front line, the chaos became indescribable. We had to climb through or over holes and protuberances of more than 6 yards. My head was spinning. I no longer had the strength of a child. We could see the smoke hanging over the Russians' position as well. The Kriegsmarine must have scored several direct hits. On our way, we passed several fellows who were freezing behind their guns. They stared at us as if everything was our fault. We went on without a word. Manners, the weapon of the unmannerly, counted for nothing here. Everything was dead except courage, if that was still of any importance. We had nearly reached our hole, with another 150 yards to go. I could see the earth heaped around it, and the empty munitions boxes, and the hole where we would freeze for hours on end, and perhaps even die. What difference did it make where we were? It was just as cold in our bunker. Anyway, to hell with it. I was still alive. But what was Wiener doing? He had stopped. I couldn't understand it, but it was all the same to me. I was so tired. But why was he firing? Wiener had set up his machine gun right on the ground, without even opening its front legs, and was sweeping the crest of our hole with short bursts of fire. Everyone else had instinctively found a hole. Hals was right beside me, but I couldn't look at him. He had grown old too quickly. He might have been 50 years old. "We'll soon find out," he muttered through clenched teeth. The veteran threw a grenade which landed near our former position. What an extraordinary man Wiener was. If our own troops had been in the hole, they would have shouted. The Popovs were quiet. If they had tried to fool us by shouting, we would have recognized that trick right away. But Wiener had obviously been right. They were firing at us now. That was their answer. "Schweinehund!" shouted Wiener. "Bastards!" Wiener should have been a general, or even the Führer. We had more confidence in him than in anyone else. He was firing straight at those damned moujiks. No one dared move, and to make matters even more disturbing, we could hear the noise of tanks coming toward us from behind the ridge of banked-up earth. We knew that there were 1 or 2 Russian tanks back there, which were now going to direct their fire at us. Wiener had undoubtedly made the same calculations. He was sliding carefully backward, dragging his gun. To my left, one of our men had just been hit. "Let's go back!" Hals shouted. But moving back was just as dangerous as moving forward. Who could I think of to give myself more courage? My mother? Did I even have a mother? Of Paula? But what good was my version of love in my universe? of my own skin. My skin looked like Hals's, and I didn't have the courage to look at that anymore. It's madness to have courage for nothing. There was Wiener, our leader. He was worth dying for. We had to abandon our friend Hans. His hip had been shattered, and under Russian fire we could do nothing for him. We said goodbye to him. He would know how to die, since he had known how to live at Memel. We didn't worry about it. We reached a shell hole where we set up our 2 light machine guns ready to fire. As we had expected, the Russians were now plastering the area we had just left with fire from their tanks. The war machine was starting up again both to the north and to the south. The Russians were coming down into our trench. It was terrible to see them, and we felt half dead with fright. Wiener wasn't firing. He looked at us and we looked at him, as if praying for advice. Reflected on his face, we could see the immensity of the disaster. "Get out!" he shouted suddenly, his voice rising above the noise of the guns. "Get out of here as quick as you can." We had already grabbed our things and plunged down into the bottom of the hole. We stopped for a moment and stared at Wiener. "Come on," shouted Ferrum. "Shut up, Pastor, you get out too." But Ferrum had his duties which kept him where he was. "You go on for the love of God. Clear out and don't worry about me. I've had enough of fighting and retreating. Wiener, there'll be no room for me after the war, remember?" The veteran had opened fire. He was firing like a madman at the Russians who were coming along the trench. Ferrum called again, but the sound of the gun drowned out his voice. We ran back off that ground which was shifting and crumbling under our feet. The position was no longer tenable. Why didn't Wiener follow us? 10 minutes later, we plunged down into our mortar and anti-tank positions. 500 yards to the east, we could see a thick cloud of smoke rising from the position we had just left. As the deluge of war poured over us, and the parapet of the gun pit trembled like the railings of a ship caught in a storm, we clung to our guns with trembling hands as to our last salvation. The fire from the ships made a critical difference to us. Without it, we would have been overrun. The danger was so pressing that no one could leave his post. Through the sharp noise of the guns, we could hear the wounded groaning. Such a peak of tragedy was beyond understanding. Each of us felt alone, stripped of all feeling and all judgment. Perhaps there would not even be time for a few hours of rest before our deaths. The men waiting at the piers had gone back to points of defense. This was not altruism, but simple self-interest. They knew that if Memel fell, no one would leave. At a high pitch of fury, they drew on their last reserves of strength to keep watch and prevent Ivan from destroying their cavalry and their hope. Memel still held. Memel, a small island of courage drawn from an infinity of anguish, but the boats didn't come. Had we been abandoned? Had this final reason for fighting vanished too? Was this the end? However, the following night, a ship drew into shore like a ghost. A crowd of dying men ran toward her, fighting among each other for places. No order could have held them back. In any case, the officers were in the same state as their men. Here, no one fought because a whistle blew. We fought because there was no other possibility. It seemed that the ship had not come to pick up men, but food. We had enough food to hold out for another 3 months, but since we were to be withdrawn immediately, these supplies should have been destroyed. However, to the south, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees who were dying of hunger and cold. The crowd which had collected near the shore heard the voice of the naval officer shouting through an amplifier. At first, they couldn't understand these words, which seemed to be coming from another world, from a man whose floating mobility allowed him to see the worst from a distance. They vaguely grasped that from their misery they could still help other people farther to the south. A single word ran through their minds in an endless refrain: immediately, immediately, immediately. The boat loaded up with our supplies and took on a few wounded. Immediately. The crowd stood motionless, wrapped in a silence as large as the night. Our diminished group had been sent to the northern edge of the stronghold, to a beach beside the sea, overhung by moderately high cliffs. We still held the cliff tops, in bunkers which had been built facing the sea. However, the Russians had also reached the cliff tops at several points, and even though they were not yet there in strength, they had sent out sharpshooters who controlled the rocky beach along which we were crawling under their fire. The German positions on these heights were fortified islands, surrounded by the enemy and living on God knows what. There was no longer any question of the Gross Deutschland division or any other division. Everything which could still move in Memel was alive, and anything alive had to be used. A ragged officer had brought us to this point where he feared the Russians might break through our rear lines. Although the position was very dangerous, it was at least somewhat less dangerous than the official front. Tanks couldn't get through unless they reached the heights, which we still dominated and weakly defended. For shelter, we used the holes dug by civilian refugees who had waited here for deliverance by sea. We were in almost constant contact with the Russians. Ivan moved along the length of the coast, peppering us from the cliffs. Sometimes he used mortars. The sandy soil was as churned up as if a harrow had been through it, and we were constantly digging out both the living and the dead. However, in this soft soil, the impact of missiles was usually dissipated. The Russians were just playing with us, but they gave us no respite. If our heads hadn't been empty, they would have burst with exasperation. Although the cold was cruel, nature had also sent us fog, which was an ally. The Russians had infiltrated our lines and were sometimes even killed from behind. They were afraid too, and were hoping that support from their artillery and tanks would crush once and for all this cemetery where even the dead seemed to defy them. They infiltrated with great caution, and when they thought we could hear them, they shouted insults at us, telling us what they would do to our wives and mothers. They also said they were planning to remove parts of ourselves. Sometimes, too, they sang. Hals and I listened with our fingers on our triggers, because they often sang and shouted like that to distract us. I, moi drugi Germanski, kak sabachi cholet, yatibaj skaju spatiba uyudna mamenchka. Then they would count. Listen, German soldiers, you are going to die. Listen, raz, diva, tri. Then they would let off a volley, while we listened in silence, like antennae destined to pick up all the ignominies on earth. During the night, 2 more boats came. At the risk of instant death, a crowd of ragged soldiers ran to board them. We were too far from the shore to get there in time. As the nausea rose in our throats, we stood powerless, trying to calculate our isolation. Every time a boatload withdrew, our defense was weakened to that degree. Nothing could stop Ivan now. As soon as the wave broke, we would run like rats. The long nightmare turned heavily in our minds, and we all trembled uncontrollably. Hals had lifted his gun to his head. I must have stared at him with enough sorrow to stop him. He turned back onto his stomach and crushed his face into the ground. The next day we were still covered with fog. The front was quiet. Were the Russians preparing something? Hals and Schlesser had crawled toward the water, toward a smashed car which stood in the spray at the edge of the beach. I joined them, taking maximum precautions. Hals spoke in a half-whisper. You help us, Sajer. We'll get those inner tubes. 3 of them are still good. To make floats? Yes, a raft. But be careful. We don't have any tools, so we'll have to use bayonets. Do it like this, but be careful. I felt as if a shaft of light had pierced my mind. A raft. We might float for a long time, but this also might be our last chance. We had no tools, and we would have to get the tires off the wheels without lifting them. Trembling with anxiety, we set about this desperate task. The inner tubes had to be full of air, otherwise they'd be no good to us. Ferham came over and joined us. You're crazy, he said. Even if you get the tubes out, they're sure to burst. After all, it's the tire that holds the pressure in. It was true that we'd been half off our heads for quite a while now. We couldn't give up the idea of escape, and received Ferham's objectivity with ferocious scowls. Then let's take the whole wheel, Hals said. I'm sure they won't float, said Ferham. Shut up, roared Hals. You stick to your god. Myself, I have more confidence in these tires. Ferham said nothing more, and like the rest of us tried to free the nuts with the tip of his bayonet. It took us at least 2 hours to complete the job. We also had to dig away the sand from under the right front tire, as the wreck was lying on its side. We could hear the sound of heavy mortars in Memel. The ground shook as far out as we were, and it seemed likely that the Russians had taken a big slice of what was left of the town. We no longer dared to think about what might be happening there, concentrating instead on the ridiculous work we had undertaken. Twice we were forced to give it up and get back to our holes. The Russians were infiltrating all along our positions, crawling through the fog almost everywhere. Hals and I clung to each other in our refuge. For the 7th or 8th time, we had fired almost point blank on Asiatic-looking men with Asiatic faces. Each time our rifles shook in our hands, and we trembled with fright. By evening, the whole city looked like a volcano. Stalin's organs were howling without stopping, loosing a storm of random fire. Our shattered nerves no longer reacted. Everything was at once hazy and luminous. By now there were 7 or 8 of us fastening belts and boards onto the 3 tires which would probably never float. 7 or 8 who would probably be killing each other within minutes, for it was clear that the raft would never hold all of us. It was ready. Schlesser and Fairham pushed it toward the water. We followed, like wolves afraid of missing part of the feast. "Wait a minute, I'll give it a try," said Ferrum. We all took a step forward. Ferrum looked at us. He knew that if he went too far, we would kill him. Our silhouettes wavered against the lights which were consuming Memel, and our eyes followed the movement of the raft as it pitched, half submerged on the dark water which melted into the night and fog. As Fairham tried to maintain a balance which every physical law made impossible, he must have prayed to the sadistic God who watched him sink. He didn't jump until the water had risen over his belt, as our safety foundered before our eyes. The night passed slowly, lit by the huge fires. The beach, from which we stared with enormous eyes, shifted from pink to orange. A very young boy from one of the Volkssturm groups had succumbed to despair. His body remained wedged upright in the midst of our group, most of whom didn't even notice that he had died. Another suddenly stood up and walked off, as if hypnotized by the flames in the south, moving toward Memel in a state which was certainly not conscious. We watched him disappear into the brilliant, unreal half-darkness. The Russians could have taken us by surprise now, without any attempt on our part to intercept them. The horrified faces of the last soldiers in the armies of the East were fixed with fascination on the apocalypse of Memel. At daybreak, the fire over the ruins of the town had turned pale yellow, almost white. We were given no orders or coordinates and remained where we were, motionless and almost senseless, lost in the hideous solitude. Toward the middle of the day, Vollers, our leader, said that he was leaving for Memel. He didn't order us to follow him, but we did. Halfway there, we collapsed on the road. Our strength was gone, and the half-mile we had been able to stumble was all we could manage. Somewhere, a short distance to the east, they were still fighting. How was it possible that any of our men still survived? A heavy black cloud with a red base lay motionless across the whole horizon, and to the south, at the docks, there were other fires. Could anyone still be alive in that place? We lay where we were, prostrate and silent, with our eyes fixed on the enormity of the catastrophe. Hours passed. Our lives were running out, and our eyes had a strange fixity. No one thought of opening the few cans we had left. We knew that any food would taste too bitter with the taste of Memel. Once again, darkness covered us, and our motionless group melted into the fog which lay like a winding sheet over Memel and stagnated on the sea. Another group of bent men walked slowly by some 10 yards from us. They seemed somehow unreal. Were they German survivors still wandering through this little piece of the void which fate still allowed us? Were they Russians? Or were they perhaps a dream? I don't know how long we stayed there, perhaps for another day and night. No one can be exact about a nightmare. Also, it is a question of no great importance. Some things, like Memel, cannot be measured by any ordinary scale. I still need corroboration to believe that Memel really happened and is not the fantasy of a spell of madness. Describing it as I have done still makes me tremble with horror and suffer again, for even the memory is painful. The tomb of Memel, where no one has ever gone to meditate, will receive my recollections as a humble and discreet offering. I make no appeals to humanity and cry for no vengeance. Except for these lines I remain silent, because I have lost my power of discretion. I have also learned, in my solitude, that there is no power more unalterable than the power of forgiveness. At some point, we became aware of sounds from the sea. Every sound from the sea could still mean life. We stood up and listened. The noise, which was scarcely audible, was muffled and heavy like an idling engine, and then there was the sound of voices, at first blurred and incomprehensible. We walked out into the water, scarcely aware of its touch. Through two bursts of thunder, we caught some words. Here, Window! Here, Window! They were asking about Window, a city farther to the north. A boat with all its lights out was lost in the fog. The voice kept on calling. It was probably coming through a megaphone. We trembled and shouted as loud as we could with what was left of our strength. Window! We had all run into the water like madmen. The first shock revived us for a moment. We went on shouting as the water reached our chests. Some men stumbled and fell, and then staggered to their feet again, still shouting. Soon the water was up to our chins. We thought we would pull off our clothes and swim. Then the vague outline of the boat emerged from the fog, and we shouted again. The boat scraped against the sand and stopped. Half drowned, we went out to meet our salvation. Swimming, floating, sinking, and surfacing again, we reached the sides of the boat. We could just make out the men leaning over the side, sailors who were throwing us lines and nets. They were asking us questions, but no one answered. We were all hanging on to anything that was thrown out to us, gasping and imploring. I thrust my fingers into a hole whose edge was encrusted with rivets, my fingers, half dead with cold, gripped like claws. Everyone was shoving and pushing for a rope or net. The icy cold of the water began to break my will. Stiff with suffering, I kept my hold and fought against losing consciousness. An empty cigarette package floated from my pocket and lay on the water some inches from me. I stared at it to fix my wandering attention, and as I stared, my vision grew hazy. Everything had become painless, and I scarcely felt the arms which were pulling me on board. They put me down on the deck, beside my exhausted companions. We were nothing but a shapeless, soaking mass, like a huge mound of wet sacking. Through my semi-consciousness, I realized they were passing around cups of boiling hot tea, which I swallowed down to the peril of my inner organs. My motionless gaze remained fixed on the flaming Prussian coast. I no longer have any clear memory of what happened next. I don't really understand why we didn't die of exposure on the deck. Perhaps the sailors rubbed us to keep us warm. I can only remember one thing clearly. The roar of the war coming from the land dominated all the sounds of the boat and of the sea. Later, the boat arrived at Pillau, where we got off. On trembling legs, surrounded by a flood of refugees, we reached a first aid station, where our physical condition was checked. A multitude of wounded men were sitting or lying all around us in huge open sheds. The little port seemed filled with a sense of feverish agitation and urgency. If the war had not yet arrived, it was nonetheless very close. We sensed its imminence and could hear its thunder to the northeast. That concludes the 38th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.